the swaggering Major Sergius Saranov challenges to a duel the cannily nondescript Swiss Captain Blunchley, whom he takes to be his romantic rival. Suddenly withdrawing his challenge, Sergius explains why he won't fight. The reason is that it takes two men, real men of heart, blood, and honor, to make a genuine combat. I could no more fight with you than I could make love to an ugly woman. You've no magnetism. You're not a man, you're a machine. Blunchley's answer, quite true, quite true. I always was that kind of chap. I'm very sorry. A later example comes from Shaw's The Apple Cart of 1929, the most appallingly germane of his plays for our day because it works with a manufactured crisis. In this drama, King Magnus presides over a cabinet of ministers and politicos who for the most part are a clutch of self-important toadies and bullies who collectively insult, browbeat, and do their worst to undermine him. Proteus, the prime minister, then Balbus, Crassus, Berenices, McConnell, Cruz, Boehner, Bachmann, what? Anyway, come back to me. The king's haughty mistress, Orinthia, outraged by his tolerance, eggs him on. You will condescend to fight with Proteus for power? Magnus replies blandly, oh no, I never fight, but I sometimes win. Orinthia bristles. If you were a real man, you would just delight in beating him into a jelly. Magnus, a real man would never do as a king. I am only an idol, my love, and all I can do is draw the line at being a cruel idol. It is not that Blunchley, Magnus, and others like them have learned to repress their hostility. They simply don't feel any. Each of them understands that it is more important not to make enemies than to have friends who like him. In Shaw's last full-length play, Buoyant Billions, written in 1947 when he was only 91, the family solicitor, Sir Ferdinand Flopper, cautions his client, we really must not be personal, but is checked by Mrs. Secondborn. Whatever is not personal is not human. Is there a belated note of self-criticism in that observation? Shaw's acknowledgement of a lack, something missing in himself? If so, the sword cuts both ways. If Shaw's impersonality limited him in some regards, it liberated him in others. He always was that kind of chap. The defense I've offered of Shaw's unflappability leads to the general question of his relation to feeling in a more profound sense. In his biography, Archibald Henderson wrote, I once asked Mr. Shaw what answer he had to make to the statement that he was a bloodless, passionless, intellectual machine. Shaw might have retorted, as he often did, that intellect is itself a passion. But in this case, he protested, look here, real feeling is the most difficult thing in the world to recognize. I think that this enticing hint was meant to stress broader feeling, an ardor for the enlightenment of humanity, to enable men and women to climb the next rung on the ladder of cultural evolution. But while this implicit defense is pertinent in that grander sense, it sidesteps the question of Shaw's seeming inability to bond with others in personal relationships. What we need here is a test case to dramatize this issue, and I think I have one. In July 1932, Nancy Astor, a transplanted Virginian who became the first woman elected to the British House of Commons, arranged a brief meeting to introduce Bernard Shaw to her friend Helen Keller in London. Soon circulating in the international press were variations of the following story from Life magazine. GBS met Helen Keller at Lady Astor's after an involved Shaw witticism Lady Astor reminded him that Miss Keller was deaf and dumb and blind. Shaw's alleged response, "All Americans are blind and deaf and dumb." After being manhandled by New York reporters during his American trip, Shaw explained himself with uncharacteristic asperity. "I tell you, I have been misquoted everywhere, and the inaccuracies are chasing me around the world. Someone takes a joking remark meant in all kindness and says I insulted Helen Keller by saying, 'Oh, all Americans are deaf and blind and dumb anyway.' How absurd. I remember meeting her in London, as they say in their attacks, at Lady Astor's. Conversation was difficult, as you would suppose, considering that she is both blind and deaf, and everything has to be spelled out by someone else on her fingers. It was rather embarrassing. It would have been in the worst possible taste for me to ignore her condition. So I remarked, by way of a compliment, that she was wonderful, and added, jokingly, that she could see and hear better than her countrymen, who could neither see nor hear." However kindly meant, had Shaw lapsed into that worst possible taste that he sought to avoid? His memory of having remarked, by way of a compliment, that she was wonderful sounds to me like an attempt after the fact to revise not only what the yellow press, but what Helen Keller herself, as we shall see, had found hurtful. A different account of the incident is found in Hesketh Pearson's biography, published with Shaw's heavy coaching in the early 40s. As Pearson puts it, before his arrival in New York, the story had got about that he had been rude to Helen Keller. It was reported that on being introduced to her, Shaw had said, "All Americans are blind, deaf, and dumb." Pearson continues, "I asked him whether there was a word of truth in the story. Not a syllable, he declared. What I may have said, and probably did say after meeting her, was, 'I wish all Americans were blind, deaf, and dumb.' We got on famously together. She didn't actually kiss me, but she smiled all over." Shaw's intended point seems to have been that if Helen Keller exemplified what a deaf and blind person could be, then everyone should be both in order to emulate her extraordinary achievements and courageous spirit. Without questioning Shaw's kind intent, we may ask how likely is it that Helen Keller would have gotten the joke, so kindly intended, especially from a total stranger. I mean, it's not as if these two were beer-drinking buddies who could kid around. To begin with, they were both teetotalers, so the analogy is not apt. But I think we do have an instance here of how Shaw's need to counteract his own emotional unease could make him seem callous. However, Shaw was not insensible. He had lots of feelings, among which fear of feeling may have been foremost. The indisputable authority on this incident is none other than Helen Keller herself. A year afterward, she wrote in the book Helen Keller in Scotland, "Lady Astor tried to interest him in me. 'You know, Mr. Shaw,' she said, 'that Miss Keller is deaf and blind.' 'Why, of course,' he replied, 'all Americans are blind and deaf and dumb.' When Lady Astor later tried to reassure her that Shaw, whom she called one of the kindest men who ever lived, had made the remark only to disregard her handicap, Helen granted that she believed him to be one of the greatest of men, but certainly not one of the kindest. Then to her readers, he consented to have his picture taken with Lady Astor and me, you've got it, and the long-anticipated meeting with an author whose books I had read with the liveliest pleasure came to an end in as short a time as it takes to write it. Now, how biographers could miss that, I don't know, but it's there. What Helen Keller might reasonably have expected is suggested by her book, The World I Live In. published long before when she was only 28 and already world famous, in which she wrote, "I am told that the glance of a beloved eye thrills one from a distance, but there is no distance in the touch of a beloved hand." In their meeting, Shaw's fear of feeling was literally a fear of being felt. He could not hear her talking to him by touch. It was rather embarrassing, you'll remember that he said, and Shaw cannot deal with embarrassment. A second example of a response just as off-key in tone was sent to his famous friend H.G. Wells. Upon learning that Wells's wife Jane was dying of cancer, Shaw wrote a doubtless well-intentioned letter to Wells that ran in part, "I am greatly relieved that the verdict is inoperable. Incurable means only that the doctors and surgeons cannot cure it," which we knew beforehand. Ever eager to give free medical advice to the terminally ill, Shaw goes on to prescribe starvation on water and orange juice, not very hopefully on the calculation that at least it is as good a way to die as any other. After a second letter in like tone, Charlotte, Mrs. GBS, tried to calm troubled waters. "Please, H.G., don't be angry with him. You know he is like that. He must somehow let himself go in this aggravating way, and he means it all so much better than well." Neither Charlotte nor Wells picked up on the key point left to the end of Shaw's note, where his words ran, "I cannot express my feelings. The thing is quite beyond that." Indeed it was, and indeed he could not. The obverse of such consolatory miscues is that when writing to bereaved persons he did not know well or at all, perhaps for that very reason, Shaw can cool-headedly touch just the right chord. In August of 1922, he and Charlotte had met and dined with Michael Collins, a patriot and head of the Provisional Irish Free State, who 3 days afterwards was murdered in an ambush by a faction of the Irish Republican Army. To Collins' sister, Joanna, Shaw sent this: "I met Michael for the first and last time on Saturday last, and I'm very glad I did. I rejoice in his memory and will not be so disloyal to it as to snivel over his valiant death. Only then does he permit himself to invoke subversively the rhetoric of tribulation for such occasions. So tear up your mourning and hang out your brightest colors in his honor, and let us all praise God that he hadn't to die in a snuffy bed of a trumpery cough, weakened by age and saddened by the disappointment that would have attended his work had he lived." Here, the personal distance from Johanna worked to Shaw's advantage. I wonder if he could achieve that combination of poignancy and uplift if he had actually known her. Another case of Shaw's getting it right has a special interest to me personally. In 1918, a barely grown-up boy from India, Amiya Chakravarti, having lost his brother in a terrible accident for which he blamed a wrathful God, wrote to Shaw, of all people, in search of comfort. He did and did not receive it. Shaw pegged his 18-year-old correspondent's despair to belief that God is omnipotent. "No doubt if he is," Shaw said, "he is responsible for everything that happens in the universe. And the fact that there is cruelty in the world proves him cruel, injustice proves him unjust, and mortality proves him futile to people like yourself who have so little imagination that they want to live forever, a horrible fate. Or is your self-love so prodigious that you were sure you would never grow tired of Amiya Chakravarti, even after enduring 100,000 years of him?" Pressing his point harder, Shaw asks, "But who told you God is omnipotent? You ask yourself why God made you, and your answer is that he made you that he might amuse himself by tormenting you. Are you then so very amusing or interesting that you are a sufficient occupation for God?" Now, I met Chakravarti in 1960 when he had become professor of literature and religion at Boston University, and he showed me this letter before it had been published or become known. When I asked if he had been offended by it, this gentle and wise man laughed. What? Here I was, a bereaved nobody from nowhere. I wrote to the most famous man of letters in the Western world, and he answered. What Shaw gave me was shock therapy, but the reply itself was all the consolation I needed. So we have now come far enough to be able to see how the fact of Shaw's impersonality is a case in point of the uneasy coexistence of self-protective detachment and empathy in his character when he felt emotionally stressed. This need shows us still more about his way with a play. On those rare occasions when Shaw writes himself into a fix where he needs to express emotion directly, the result feels strained. But the obverse of that limitation is that when he comes at a similar situation obliquely, he can touch us in a way that is very much his own. For instance, one aspect of life that arouses intense feeling in most of us is love. Love in all its aspects, including friendship, which brings us opportunely to the inspired irresolution of the conclusion of Pygmalion, first performed, by the way, exactly 100 years ago. At the end of the earliest and best version of the play, Eliza Doolittle, brave but not quite sure of herself, sweeps out of Henry Iggin's life in his mother's drawing room. Like Ibsen's Nora in A Dollhouse, she exits grandly, but we may sense in her fine excess of certitude that the door, as metaphor, there is no door, is left open a crack. So from the first night on, audiences and readers, directors, actors, determined to complete the romance between Higgins and Eliza that they desired and expected, sought ways to do just that, the easiest of which is, after a few seconds, representing much more than that in stage time, to have her return, which happens in both the film and in My Fair Lady. Quite piqued, Shaw added, when the play was published, a postscript in the form of an essay insisting that Eliza actually married the nebbishy Freddie Eynsford Hill. Since this prospect was barely hinted at and promptly dissed in the play text itself, practically no one has ever been convinced by it. Yet in the film, directed by Gabriel Pascal 25 years later in 1938, Shaw tried again to make the Eliza-Freddie match work by providing a love scene to suggest an erotic pull between them. Inserted ever since, near the close of Act 4, it takes place, unsurprisingly, on the street where she lives. Liza, whatever are you doing here? Freddie, nothing. I spend most of my nights here. It's the only place